Well, that's our correspondent in New York, and he joins us now live to give us an update. Sherwin, we've heard some of what President Biden had to say at his address, and the US president always a much awaited speech at these events. What else came out of it?
You're quite right, Peter. You know, normally he speaks second on the first day of the general debate, right after Brazil. As host country, that's their slot. But given the Queen's funeral on Monday in London, Biden got into New York late and now spoke on Wednesday as opposed to Tuesday. He spoke number 7 on today's list. And I'll tell you this, an empty hall quickly filled up with member states. I mean, it was a packed audience in that General Assembly, and really speaks to certainly the view from member states of the importance of the speech from, you know, the superpower of the world, the richest economy in the world, and always a full house for that speech. He also obviously talked about, you know, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That certainly was the premise of the speech. It was the foundation of the speech, if you will, and he really called on member states to support Ukraine, because he talked about how this went to the heart of what the United Nations is about, the UN Charter, which is essentially the constitution that member states sign up for. And it's very clear and explicit in that regard that, you know, no country should invade or impugn the foreign or territorial integrity and sovereignty of a fellow member state. Ukraine's flag hangs alongside the other 192 member states here at the United Nations, so it has equal status in terms of being a member state of the United Nations and a sovereign nation at that. So that very much was his focus. He called on allied nations to give more support to Ukraine in terms of combating what he called an invasion. Biden sees what Biden sees as not only a threat to democracy, but of course, and the UN Charter. And it's worth just taking a step back here, Peter. Some 29,000 people have died in this war. 14 million people have been displaced. It has changed the the landscape that is the country of Ukraine. He also reacted to President Putin saying earlier that if Russia was threatened, they would use all means at their disposal to protect Russia and Russia's people. This has been interpreted as a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons. Biden called that threat irresponsible, arguing that a nuclear war could not be won and must never be fought. He also will speak tomorrow alongside foreign ministers in the Security Council. There is a meeting, a ministerial meeting on Ukraine in the council tomorrow, but we see on the list of speakers that President Biden will then be representing the United States. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, will also be in the room. So certainly the optics will be very, very interesting to see the body language between the two, and certainly other ministers in the room. But really, this, you know, the sparks could literally fly. Biden is known to go off the cuff from time to time, so it's going to be very interesting to see how he will lay out the U.S. position vis-a-vis Ukraine and how Russia will respond. And often what happens in this scenario is, you know, you go around the horseshoe, everybody gets to talk, but then countries can put their hands up and say, I'd like to take the floor again, and one expects that there might be a tete-a-tete and a back and forth between Russia and the United States. But that also, I imagine, depends on how long Biden can spend in the council. He is the president of the United States and might want to get back to Washington, but certainly an event to look forward to this Thursday.
All of this happening at the same time, President Putin is calling up the reservists, and we're seeing a mass exodus of some citizens. Perhaps they fit into the category of those that could be called up. Is that something that's going to be somehow couched into the conversation? What do we make of it?
Well, part of the conversation is not just what happens in the UN Security Council, Peter. It's also, you know, member states speaking in the General Assembly, and we are expected to hear from Volodymyr Zelensky. The UN General Assembly last Friday passed a special resolution that allows the Ukrainian president in this in-person format during this UN General Assembly meeting. It's an in-person event, but they've made an exception for the Ukrainian president to be able to make his remarks remotely, and it's going to be very, very interesting. We've heard some comments about, you know, Russia calling up reservists, and he lamented, did Volodymyr Zelensky, the fact that Russia was calling up more troops, and he called it a tragedy because a lot of these troops will likely lose their lives in combat, as we have seen over the last 6.5 months of this invasion. So it's going to be very interesting to get his perspective, but really The stakes are very, very high here. The implications in terms of food insecurity around the world have been plain for everybody to see. The energy costs that are going to impugn the ability of many European countries to heat their countries sufficiently during the upcoming winter months. There's a lot at play here. And of course, all this undermines the achievement and the implementation of what is essentially the United Nations blueprint. And that's called the Sustainable Development Goals, and those 17 goals that really seek to build a sustainable future. And the world can ill afford, Peter, these distractions from wars, whether you're talking about Ukraine, whether you're talking about, the deficit in terms of women's empowerment and gender equality in places like Afghanistan, the re-emergence of conflict in the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray, intractable conflicts like the Palestinian question, the independence of Western Sahara, and the list goes on. And so I think what you're going to certainly hear more and more from officials within the development space, including here at the United Nations, is the need to end these conflicts. I mean, Africa's agenda is to silence the guns by 2020, and that still hasn't happened, right? So the impetus here is very great, given the economic implications of these intractable conflicts going on, in addition, Peter, to the fact that climate change is coming for all of us.
Last word on the Security Council. Biden talking about possible reform, Africa as a region getting a permanent seat. Is this a significant indicator?
You know, it's a question I asked Naledi Pandor last week in Washington, D.C. on President Ramaphosa's visit to the White House. And she said, the details here are going to be very important. What has pushed the United States suddenly to come out and talk about Security Council reform when it has been the refrain mainly of developing countries seeking to have this a greater voice in multilateral fora, no less in the UN Security Council that is responsible for the maintenance of peace and security? So it was very interesting to hear the most powerful country's president in the world come and talk about this, but we don't have much detail. All they're saying is that we support the expansion of both non-permanent seats and permanent seats, and we support the inclusion of regions that are not included so far to date in the permanent category, regions like the Caribbean, regions like South America, regions like Africa. But what that looks like, and what that looks like in terms of the intergovernmental negotiations that are continuing, remains to be seen. And at the end of the day, Peter, it is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, never mind what they decide on in those intergovernmental negotiations, which will have to be reached through consensus. It then has to be rubber-stamped by a vote in the Security Council by the very 5 permanent members that hold the most power in this organization, that have access to something called the veto, that essentially can block the consensus of 14 members around that horseshoe table if that veto is deployed. So whether or not member states can agree on what the iteration and what the new formula might look like, it's going to come down to Russia, to China, to France, the United Kingdom, and the United States to rubber stamp. And if one of those members disagrees, everything comes to naught.
All right, so I still want to talk about Donald Trump, but final thought on UNGA. There's a new member who's arrived for the first time as head of state. I think we've got the clip now, and I just want you to talk us into it. William Ruto.
Yeah, no longer President Kenyatta. There's a new man at the helm as head of state of Kenya after a sweepingly successful election, most recently in Kenya, obviously rubber-stamped by that decision by the Kenyan Supreme Court, and making his first appearance here as head of state. This is a little bit of what he had to say. Peter, watch.
In many respects, the COVID-19 pandemic stripped us of many illusions and exposed stark justice and solidarity deficits in the face of existential crisis. It brought into sharp focus the global economy's 2-lane highway, repressively patrolled by a rising tide of exclusionist nationalism, a specter that undermines prospects of collective action and significantly impairs the resolve of the international community to guarantee fundamental rights, including safety and dignity of the world's vulnerable majority. It is also for this reason that many nations, especially from the global south, now advocate for the democratization of the global governance and a reimagined multilateralism that is inclusive and works for the good of all. Kenya stands ready to work with other nations to achieve the Pan-Africanization of multilateralism and a more just and inclusive system of global governance.
Peter, Kenya is also a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. They form a bloc called the A3, the Africa 3, with the other 2 African members in the council. And he says that the A3 in the council, as the A3 in the council, we are committed to finding a stronger African voice in the council and achieving a consensus-driven, rule-based multilateral system. It is our manifest intention to see greater Pan-Africanization of the global agenda in order to make multilateralism work for the people of the world in their diversity. And I think what you're going to hear from member states like the African member states, and Naledi Pandor, who is leading South Africa's delegation in the absence of President Ramaphosa, is of course going to speak in the General Assembly later today. And one imagines that she will also back the sentiment expressed here by President William Ruto in terms of the rules-based order that has favored more powerful countries over the years, and really speak to the Pan-Africanization of these multilateral fora. And Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has provided a little window of opportunity here, opening up the door to talk more about Security Council reform. And I can assure you there's a long line of member states ready to go through that little gap in the window, Peter.
All right, and the final question takes us out of the United Nations Assembly, but still in New York. Donald Trump, and I believe that his adult children are also named as defendants. So after a few years of investigating, it looks like the Attorney General really wants these people.
Hey man, try as we might to get away from talking about Donald Trump, we can bring all sorts of member states into New York, Peter, and we still can't escape Donald Trump being in the news. New York's Attorney General Letitia James, who was, I might add, responsible for the demise of Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York State, has filed a civil lawsuit accusing Trump and his older children, Ivanka, Don Jr., and Eric Trump, and executives of the Trump Organization, of manipulating property values to deceive lenders, insurance brokers, and tax authorities into giving them better bank loans and insurance policy rates. It's a 222-page civil lawsuit that has been filed at the New York Supreme Court, and they are asking this court to bar Trump, the executives of his company, and his children from acquiring any commercial real estate or receiving any loans from any New York registered financial institution for up to 5 years. So it's very narrow. She is the Attorney General of just the state of New York. The Trump Organization could, as he's moved his residence down to Florida, could move locations. He will have access to financial support from other entities that are outside of the jurisdiction of the New York Attorney General, but a very significant addition to the legal woes that the Trump family, former President Trump in particular, are facing, be that related to the January 6th insurrection last year, be that related to claims of election fraud. We know that various entities, for example, in the state of Georgia, and of course being led by Attorney General Merrick Garland, the federal Attorney General in Washington, investigating a number of facets related to a plethora of issues that Donald Trump is facing. So this is one where we are now moving forward. Donald Trump, of course, has dismissed the claims. He's called it a witch hunt, as you've referred to. He called Attorney General James a failed Attorney General whose lack of talent in the fight against crime is causing record numbers of people and companies to flee New York. So combative as always from Donald Trump, Peter.
All right, well, we'll watch that story, no doubt, as much as we watch reality shows. Sherwin, great talking to you. Thanks so much.